Now to part 2 of our in-depth conversation with Australian author Thomas Kenneally.
Australia's colonial history features prominently in your writings, including novels, essays, dramas, and even filmmaking. How important is the Irish past and Irishness in contemporary Australia?
Well, my grandparents found that in Australia there were the same prejudices that existed in America. The Irish were kept dumb for some centuries as a deliberate policy concept and as I said, their language was suppressed. But you see how many Irish writers shine in the English firmament. Seamus Heaney, Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats. Without Irish literature, English literature would be a much paler beast. And Australia was the sort of place where all the old prejudices, some of the old prejudices remain, but all the old institutional injustices about education, not being able to be a lawyer if you were a Catholic, not being able to, if you were one of the native Irish, not being allowed to attend a university. These things, and of course the terrible famine in mid-century, these things were very much in the mind of the Irish who came to America and to Australia. And they were very much involved in the labour movement because we were all labourers. And then my generation were educated because of Australia opened up its education to everyone. And we didn't have an established church. You know, in England, they have this established Anglican church, and it gets all the goodies, it gets all the money, and the other churches get less. Well, we never had that here. It was a place where you didn't have the strict separation that occurred in places like Northern Ireland between Catholic and Protestant. These are said to be wars of religion, but there's no such thing as a war of religion. All war is about resources and human rights. The guerrilla fighter is someone who wants human rights and wants security in his life and wants his child to be educated. And so all that happens in Australia and all that happened in America. And hence our affection for these New World places. New Zealand, too, New Zealand is a very advanced liberal democracy. And while we've been making our fortune by digging up raw materials and selling them to China and America and so on, New Zealand has become a more sophisticated country than it ever was. It used to be a primary producing colony like us, and it's become more complex. So I think the Australian inheritance was one of people wanting justice. My wife's great-grandfather was a rural activist in Ireland. My great-uncle, and he was sent here, my great-uncle was a seditionist. He made speeches in Ireland about independence and spent 10 years in Western Australia as a prisoner. I think the Irish were, when they came here, although they were servants of a very backward church, were nonetheless very democratic and very left-wing in what they wanted. They wanted trade unions, they wanted justice in all areas, justice in the courts, justice in education, and so on. And because that happened in Australia, well, you know, the results, I suppose I was an inheritor of. And now the Irish faction is not as strong as it was because it became divided. Like in America, a lot of Irish fearing communism in China and fearing communism in Russia, became right-wing. And here you had the same, we were all Labour voters until China became communist. And then everyone got scared of China. And the result was that a lot of Irish, to their shame, became very conservative and very against newcomers. And they forgot the fact that their grandparents had been despised, just like the grandparents of new immigrants, and the children of the Muslims were despised. And so you don't have that organized Irishness thing going on anymore. But it was very important in the history of the United States, and it was very important in the history of Australia. And you get instead the thing about Australian history that fascinates me, and I'll let you go on to the next question after this. We were founded as a modern society, as a penal settlement. There's no other advanced society, and I think you'd call Australia an advanced society, where you had the polity was created not by founding fathers like America, people who were too religious and too pure for Britain, but by convicts. And this is interesting. We don't have quite as many pretensions, I think, as the Americans because of this. And I'm fascinated by that. I've written a lot about convictism, about the Australia's at the southern end of the earth. It's called Down Under. So can a convict become an angel in Australia? I wrote a book called An Angel in Australia. Is a convict, the world is upside down. I'm very interested in our connection with Asia, which we spent all this time denying. And of course, in 1902, we tried to expel Chinese. They were mainly Cantonese who came to the gold rushes. Now the Australian Chinese are from everywhere. And of course, they're beginning to enter politics, and they've already captured many professions, because the Chinese, like my mother, I can understand the so-called Chinese tiger moms who make their children study. My mother was like that. She knew that education was my only chance.
Talking about the Chinese experience in Australia, I wanted to ask you about another recurring theme in your writings, which is about the European settler and Indigenous Australian relations. Two of your books, The Chant of Jimmie Blacksmith and the more recent Two Old Men Dying, I think are examples of that, interest in Australia's Indigenous history. In Two Old Men Dying, you are trying to demonstrate the shared humanity of all of us, modern and ancient men. And recent scientific studies are suggesting that the Mungo man might have migrated to Australia through Asia, or present-day Asia, and perhaps even China.
Through China, yes.
If that a fact is confirmed, I think it casts a very interesting perspective in Australia's relationship with China and the relationship with Asia.
Yes, I know paleontologists. I know the man who found Mungo Man, who is a 42,000-year-old man ritually buried in the sand dunes of a place called Lake Mungo. And it's about 16 hours out of Sydney, still in the state of New South Wales. And it's in a place that is now desert, but was once lakeland a couple of ice ages ago. And that's where Mungo Man died. He was a man who obviously lived a good life because we had megafauna in Australia. Now, in his famous poem Australia, written in 1939, A.D. Hope writes about Australia as a place without history and ideas. But Mungo Man was making history and having ideas out in Lake Mungo because life for him was much better than I think it was for my ancestors, who I think the Celts came from the plains of Central Asia, the steppes of Central Asia, and made their way to the furthest places, Wales, Brittany, Scotland, Ireland. And I was fascinated from childhood by the sight of this other race who were despised. Nomads are always despised, and the Aboriginal was seen as purely a nomad. But Mungo Man lived on that lake. He was surrounded by megafauna, giant kangaroos, giant koalas, giant parenti. The only trouble was the giant marsupial lion, who was a very scary big cat related to the koala, and with the koala's great slicing thumb. And so Mungo Man travelled only for the reasons you and I travel, to meet partners, for education, for pilgrimage, and to collect strange objects, to trade. 42,000 years ago, Mungo Man's people were trading with the people, stones, with the people in the upper Murrumbidgee area, in the snowy area of Australia, where in those days there was a great glacier near the highest mountain. This is Kosciuszko, the Polish named mountain. But so they were leading a full life. In Patrick White's Voss, Mr. Bonner says to Voss, "Will you take a map?" And how can you take a map is the submerged question in that. And Voss says, "The map I shall first make it." Now, he made the map for Europeans, but there was a pre-existent map of song lines which told you where everything is. There were men and women who could sing this endless chant that told you what was 300 miles down the road, 800 miles down the road. A woman from Uluru area told me, Aboriginal woman, told me that there is a song line, a song map that connects Uluru to North Head of Sydney. Now, many students would know, because when they come here, they will see the North Head of Manly. It's a majestic head. And it is the end of a song line that comes all the way from Uluru. So the map, the song, the vision, the poetry, the human existence, the priesthood, the wizardry, the science existed 80, 100, 120,000 years ago. Harari says that the entry of Homo sapiens into Australia was one of the most significant events in history, because there were no hominids here, and there were these great beasts, these giant animals, whose bones we do find everywhere. And that's why I'm fascinated how the kings of Australia, the kings and the rulers of Australia for all those millennia became the despised Australians whom I saw going past my gate in this country town, Kempsey, and whom I was fascinated by. Now, I had an uncle who collected the waste material the town was not sewered, and he collected the waste material in tubs. It was the Depression, a great failure of capitalism, let me say, and he took this job. It was the job he could get. And he collected cans of waste material, of human sewage, from the Aboriginal camp. And I was fascinated by that. I didn't think about it morally, but I thought, how is it that it's good enough for an European man to collect the waste materials of Aboriginals, but they're not allowed to sit with us in the cinema? Why is that so? And I was fascinated. We now know that Australia is not a young country. It's an old country. And even, as you know, a former president of China said in our parliament that we discovered the Ming Dynasty Navy, the famous Navy that was in Ambon, discovered Australia and had a good relationship with the Aboriginals. Now, that may or may not be the truth, but it's a possibility. It is a possibility because very soon after the Mings, the fall of the Ming Dynasty, you got the Portuguese here, the Spanish and the Dutch. And because the coasts they visited were more desert than the east coast, near which most of us live, which is quite delightful, but it doesn't have spices. So, the Dutch, the Portuguese, before them, the Spaniards after the Portuguese, they found nothing here on the north coast of New South Wales, of Australia rather, and on the west coast, they found nothing they wanted. And it looked like a desert country, and it was full of these people who were, the bits they touched upon were definitely nomadic, because the more desert area Aboriginals have to walk from place to place, but they have to renew the resources and perform ceremonial too. And so I think of this extraordinary country full of weird stuff, weird vegetation, weird animals, which the Aboriginals maintained for all those millennia. We've been here for 2.25 centuries. Now, there's a great deal of work being done by Australian and Chinese paleontologists that show that there are similarities between Chinese Homo sapiens and Mungo Man, and that is fascinating. That the whole of writing, the whole of arguments about human rights is based on the fact that you and I are said to be born of the one African mother, mitochondrial Eve. So that Eve's mitochondria are in me, and particularly in Caucasian women and in Chinese women. And some people think how amazing we must be kind to each other, but some think, the 150 people I know, that's enough. Everyone else is a stranger. Everyone else is subject to suspicion. And so there's a tension in every novel between us all being the children of mitochondrial Eve and then being children of a tribe. Of course, it happened because the Montagues and the Capulets were tribes. That tragedy of Romeo and Juliet happened because of tribalism. And it's a very interesting tension, and it's still there. It was there when a professor I greatly admired, Geoffrey Blaney, raised concerns about Asian immigration in the 1980s. And I had a quarrel with him because I never believed it. Because the things they were saying about the Asians, the Asian immigration, and particularly Chinese immigration, they had said about the Irish long ago. And I knew it was wrong about us, so it had to be wrong about the Chinese.
Be sure to watch the third and final instalment of our conversation with Thomas Kenneally when he talks about his acclaimed novel Schindler's Ark.